So here is our go-kart. It's evolving, elements are being added on here, but something that you may find is that it starts to become really slow to display. You can probably see right here that the display speed isn't so great. There are a couple of optimizations that you can do. There's some tips and tricks here that will really help you to speed things up. The first one is, if we just zoom in here on this mudguard, you can see that we have the ability with the Turbo Smooth modifier to have render time iterations and also viewport iterations. At the moment, we're using 3 iterations in the viewport, and we've got isoline display turned on. Isoline display is more of a modeling tool. It doesn't actually optimize the display of your mesh at all. The edges that you can see here are still basically drawn when you have isoline display turned on. It's just that they're drawn in such a way that they're not visible. It may sound really strange to say that, but I understand from the developers of 3ds Max that that is exactly the way that it's done. And because those edges are still actually handed over to the 3D hardware, it means that you're not really getting any benefit. You're not actually not rendering those edges, so you don't get any speed increase in the display. So there are 2 ways you can actually optimize things. The first and most obvious one is to change the viewport iterations and the render iterations. So you can say render iterations are 3 and the viewport iterations are 0. So that's a pretty good optimization. But another tip from the development team at Autodesk is that basically this modifier is still being evaluated, and it'll come through to here and it'll see that it has 0 iterations, and therefore it won't do any smoothing. But it's even faster to actually turn off the modifier, so no evaluation takes place of it whatsoever. That's actually much faster for the display. But the problem with that is then that we don't get any smoothing in the viewport or at render time, because we've got render time iterations turned on here. So the way you can get around that is you can not bother using render iterations. You can just turn that off. Set the iterations to what you want it to be at render time, let's say 3. And the really big advantage of this technique is that you can actually set it to be exactly what you want it to be at render time in the viewport, so you don't get any nasty surprises at render time. But once you're happy with the smoothing in the viewport and you're happy that that's going to look cool at render time, what you can do is right click on the modifier, and if you click on the light bulb you can turn it off. But in this case we don't want to turn it off 100%. We want to just turn it off in the viewport and have it turned on in the render. So if you right click and go down here, you can see you've got those options. You can have the modifier on, you can have it off, and then you can have it in states in between. You can have it off in the viewport but on during render time, and you can have it off during the render and on in the viewport. So in this case, we want it to be on during the render, so we get smoothing, and we want it to be off in the viewport, so we get fast display. So we can just say off in the viewport. And we can do the same thing for all the Turbo Smooth here, basically. We can right click here, off in the viewport. There we go. Same thing for the seat, off in the viewport. And for the back guards, off in the viewport. And just to show you that I'm not talking rubbish, let me just get this framed reasonably nicely. And I'll just turn on our render lights. I'll just do a quick render of this so you can see what I'm talking about. So let's just hit render here. And one of the things you'll notice when you look at this is that it actually takes a while before it starts rendering, and that's because it has to create the geometry. In the viewport, nothing is smoothed. At render time, we have smoothing turned on. So all of the geometry basically has to be created at render time. So it takes a little bit longer before render will actually start. But once it starts, you'll find that your geometry actually is smoothed. So as you can see, the mudguard at the back is smoothed nicely. And you can also see part of the seat here is actually smoothed just fine. And you can see here as the bonnet is revealed, you've got the nice smooth flowing curves on the bonnet, and also you can see you've got the nice curves on the front mudguards, and you can see the areas where the mudguards have been modified to allow the steering to take place. So as you can see at render time we get these nice curved surfaces, and in the viewport we get these nice, fast, easy to interact with items of geometry. So Let me just show you another optimization that we can do. If we look at this wire here, this was produced using a loft in DVD3 in this series, I believe. And it's actually a pretty dense mesh. So we can use sub-Ds on this as well to optimize this also. So what we can do is, if we go down here, you can see at the moment it's got 10 steps in its shape. We could try changing that to 5. And the path steps are 40, so let's try changing that to 20. And what we can do now is we can put a turbo smooth on top. Turbo smooth. And we've got back to what looks like pretty much the same geometry as we had before. What we can do now is, if we leave show end effect on, we can actually see the difference that adding more steps in the base mesh has. So let's try putting in 6. Let's try putting in 4. You can see even with 4, we've still got a pretty good approximation. Let's try 3, starts to break down. 2 is pretty bad. So I think we get a pretty good approximation with just 4 steps. With path steps, let's try 5. Obviously not good enough. The mesh is losing a lot of its form. Let's try 10. 15. 20. 25. And then 30. So you can see somewhere around 20 to 30, we basically don't really see much of a difference. So let's try 25, 20. Yeah. So I'd say 20 seems to be a pretty good approximation. Now, in the viewport, we still got a lot of geometry, so we can use exactly the same technique as before. So we can say turbo smooth, off in viewport, and then in the viewport, we just have this quite simple looking mesh. We can do the same thing for the other wire here. Just select it, 4, 20, turbo smooth, and let's say off in viewport. There we are. I'd actually say, looking at it close up, maybe 25 is a better option. There we go. So what else could we actually do this to? Well, it doesn't work with everything, but you can basically try it out on certain types of geometry. It works pretty well on lofts, as you've seen. You generally won't see any issues with that. Let me just put back the modeling lights back on so we can see things a bit more clearly. It'll also work quite well on certain lathes. It'll work really well on these tires because they're pretty smooth anyway, but you may have some issue with this hub here because you've got a hard edge here and that will end up being smooth. So let's see what happens when we try that out anyway. So we've got a lathe, then we put a turbo smooth on top. So you can see you've basically got almost no difference in the actual appearance. So we can then go down into the lathe and we can change the number of segments in it. So let's try 32. Let's try 24. As you can see, you don't really see that much of a difference. So let's try 24 and then let's try increasing this to 2. And let's turn on isolane and explicit normals. And down here, let's go down to the edible spline and then let's change the number of steps. So there we go. So with 1, we start to lose form here. 2, pretty good. 3, yeah, we get some more detail in here. Let's try 4 again. Actually, yeah, you probably do need to keep the number of steps. Let's try adaptive. And just put this down. No, adaptive really is putting a lot more geometry in, really. So I think really we're better off with optimize turned on and steps left at 4. And then we can have turbo smooth at 2, off in the viewport. So we get this chunky geometry in the viewport. And then at render time, we'll end up obviously with high quality wheels. So because this is an instance, we get that same behavior here. And we've got the same on the back wheel, on the back tire, and this tire here. So they're all optimized now. So let's try doing the same thing with this hub here. So let's just zoom out a little bit. Put a turbo smooth modifier on there. And you can see what actually happens here. You get this smoothing going on here. So in some cases, it can have no noticeable effect. In the other cases, it will have an effect here. Now, in this case, it may be that, let's say you actually like that smoothing. Let's say we like that. So you can just basically keep that. If we went it down in here, we can put this down to 24. And it has very little effect on the end result. Obviously, we've got the smoothing here. If you wanted to, you could go into the original spline and modify that and put in some points there to actually stop that smoothing taking place. But in this case, I actually quite like it. So let's have a look around here. Yeah, they're all instants, so they all get the same effect. So we'll just turn that off in the viewport. So off in viewport. There we go. So again, we've optimized this, and at render time, we'll get some nice looking geometry. That's just a couple of ways that you can actually speed up your workflow a bit and get good viewport performance. If you look in here on the cog, you can see I've actually done the same thing here. Turbo smooths off in the viewport, and the same thing for all of the teeth. And yeah, this is going to give us much faster interactive viewport performance. And then at render time, we're going to end up with the same smooth mesh that we want. So it's a very useful kind of workflow to follow there. Okay, so let's move on into the next chapter, and we'll wrap up this DVD with one last technique, which can be very, very powerful.